Noam Chomsky, speaking on creation and culture at the end of the 20th century. Recorded November 25th, 1992, at the Institute of North American Studies in Barcelona, Spain.
Thank you. I should perhaps open by saying that it's a particular pleasure and honor for me to have the opportunity to speak in Barcelona, in part for purely personal reasons. The first political article that I wrote almost 54 years ago was about Barcelona, in fact, the fall of Barcelona, and the events of the preceding years had an enormous impact on my own personal understanding of the world, on my political and moral consciousness, and have left an impact on my own thinking and understanding and feeling about things that's been of long duration and very great impact. The topic that has been presented is far too vast to address in any comprehensive way. I would like to express some thoughts about a few selected aspects of intellectual creation and moral culture as we approach the new millennium. Since the great scientific revolutions of the 17th century, there's been impressive progress in understanding the natural world. That understanding, however, has had a rather narrow focus. It excludes almost entirely large areas of fundamental human concern and the questions that arise within them. These have not proven amenable to rational inquiry in anything like the manner of the natural sciences. Thus, a great deal is understood about the structure of matter and about the laws that determine its properties and interactions, but very little is understood about matters that concern us directly in our lives and our attempt to comprehend the world, questions concerning the nature and properties of human thought and action, moral judgment and social relations, and others like them, remain stubborn, elusive, resistant to inquiry beyond our intellectual grasp. The domains are not sharply delimited, but the qualitative differences are striking and unmistakable. A distinction is sometimes made between the natural sciences and the human sciences, but that is misleading. The natural sciences have attained theoretical depth and explanatory power, while the so-called human sciences are for the most part descriptive commentary, more or less enlightening, but leaving virtually untouched very troublesome and puzzling questions that have been posed for thousands of years. We might use the traditional terms physical and mental, or matter and mind, to distinguish the two domains in a general way, as long as we do not invest these vague and misleading concepts with significance that they cannot bear. In the domain of the physical, much remains unknown. To mention only one example, physicists tell us that 90% of the matter in the universe is what is called dark matter. Dark because we don't see it, dark because we don't know what it is, the eminent physicist Victor Weisskopf observes. But there is an intelligible intellectual project that addresses these questions, and it seems reasonable to expect further progress that will continue to unravel what now seems mysterious. The situation seems rather different when we confront what appear to be simple and uncontroversial facts about humans, facts as obvious to us as the array of physical objects around us and their properties, questions of free choice, of consciousness, of right and wrong, of others central to our lives. It may be helpful to recall how these topics were understood at the dawn of the modern period. The Cartesian framework of the 17th century viewed the whole range of issues from a standpoint not too remote from that of unreflective common sense. The world consists of solid objects which interact through direct contact. If I want to move a chair that is across the room, I have to touch it directly or through an extension of my body, say a stick that I hold. I cannot move the chair simply by raising my arm, nor can I see the chair, according to the Cartesians, unless a rigid rod reaches from the chair to my eye and thus causes my eye to react to the chair. The objects of the world are governed by a kind of contact mechanics. Among these objects are people, with many properties quite familiar and obvious to us. Each of us knows, as well as we know anything, that we see the world in a certain way, feel joy and sadness, can choose our actions within our physical limitations, and so on. And experience suggests that others are like us in these respects. But to take the example that was central to Cartesian thought and happens to have been a personal preoccupation of mine for many years, Descartes observed that normal human speech has certain surprising properties. It's boundless in scope. In ordinary discourse, we're constantly saying and hearing entirely new things and can do so without any limit. It's undetermined by external stimuli or internal states. In my present state and surroundings, I can choose to continue to speak on this topic, or if I choose, I can talk about the weather in Boston. But ordinary speech, while undetermined, is not random. Ordinary speech is coherent and appropriate to situations. It is appropriate but apparently uncaused, an important distinction. It evokes thoughts that the listener might have expressed in the same way. We may call that collection of properties the creative aspect of language use. As the Cartesians recognized, these elementary and relatively uncontroversial observations about human language extend to human behavior quite generally. They are manifestations of the property of free will, which is what is called phenomenologically obvious, simply part of our immediate experience, as apparent to us as anything we know. A qualification is in order right away, that much of what seems apparent is not true. We see that the sun sets, and we see that the moon is larger near the horizon, and we count the waves that flee the place of their creation and dash against the shore, as Leonardo da Vinci put it. But we have learned that these perceptions misrepresent the facts, and the same could be true about our perception that we can choose freely within our physical limitations. What appears to be certain knowledge could turn out to be illusion, but there's no reason to believe this, apart from dogma, even if we do not understand what lies beyond determinacy and randomness. As Descartes observed, we may not, I'm quoting him, we may not have intelligence enough to comprehend the nature of free choice and action, though we are so conscious of the liberty and indifference which exists in us that there is nothing we comprehend more clearly and perfectly, and it would be absurd to doubt that of which we inwardly experience and perceive as existing within ourselves, just because we do not comprehend a matter which, from its nature, we know to be incomprehensible. More accurately, we do not know that it is incomprehensible to us, though we might speculate that this is so, but it is surely not comprehended, a fact that does not provide sufficient reason to doubt what we experience. Well, so far we're pretty much within the domain of common sense, of things that are obvious to us if we pay a little attention to what we experience and what we do. Reasoning further, Descartes argued that the creative aspect of language use and other similar properties of human action lie beyond the capacities of any material object, any automaton that might be constructed. And we may include here modern computers, since nothing essential changes when we move from the complex artifacts that fascinated the 17th century mind to those that excite many of the same questions and speculations today. As the Cartesians put the matter, if the parts of an automaton are arranged in a fixed manner and the environment is fixed, then the device is compelled to act in a certain way, apart from a possible random element which changes nothing essential. But a human, under similar conditions, is only incited and inclined to act in a certain way, not compelled. Humans may tend to act as they are incited and inclined to do. So prediction of behavior may be possible within a certain range, and a theory of motivation might be within reach, but all of these endeavors miss the central point. The person could have chosen to act otherwise within the limits of physical capacity, even in ways that are harmful or suicidal. Theories of prediction of behavior or of motivation, even if they were successful in their own terms, would not qualify as serious theories of behavior. Human action is coherent and appropriate, but uncaused, apparently. Appropriateness to situations, it must be sharply distinguished from the causal effects of situations and internal states. There is little reason to suppose that human behavior is caused in any sense of the word that we understand. These considerations lie at the heart of the dualist metaphysics of the Cartesians, which again accords rather well with our common sense understanding. And we then have two kinds of scientific inquiry, into matter and into mind, with serious problems about their interaction. All of this is quite reasonable science, in my opinion, although fundamentally wrong, as was quickly discovered. As we know, the essentials of this common sense view did not survive the 17th century. But it's important to recall that what collapsed was the Cartesian theory of matter. The theory of mind, such as it was, has undergone no fundamental critique. Newton demonstrated that common sense contact mechanics was remarkably not true. I can move a remote object by raising my arm. In fact, terrestrial and planetary motion are governed by a principle of action at a distance that is completely contrary to common sense, indeed unintelligible. Newton himself was disturbed by the need to rely on what he described as an occult property to account for the simplest physical phenomena. He agreed with Cartesians in his words. I'm now quoting Newton. It is inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without the mediation of something else which is not material, operate upon and affect other matter without mutual contact. The idea of action at a distance through a vacuum is so great an absurdity, Newton wrote, that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. We cannot possibly believe that a body can act where it is not, even though Newton had proven that that's exactly what happens. So he was perplexed, deeply perplexed, as were other scientists of the day. Newton concluded from this paradoxical situation that we must be satisfied with the fact that universal gravity exists, even if we cannot understand it or explain it in terms of the self-evident mechanical philosophy, as common sense theory of the world was called in those days. The leading Newton scholar, I. Bernard Cohen, remarks that this intellectual move set forth a new view of science, in which the goal is not to seek ultimate explanations, but to find the best theoretical account we can of the phenomena of experience and experiment. And with that move, we enter modern science. Proceeding further, we should also recognize that there is no determinate notion of body or matter since Newton. The world is what it is. The domain of the physical is nothing other than what we come more or less to understand and hope to assimilate to the core natural sciences in some way, perhaps by modifying them radically, as has often been necessary. Whatever ideas are needed to yield understanding and insight are judged valid, part of the presumed truth about the world, insofar as they enter into intelligible explanatory theory. Our criteria of rationality and intelligibility may also change and develop as understanding grows. If it is proposed that space-time is curved, or that the world consists of infinite one-dimensional strings in 10-dimensional space, or massless particles, or that time had a beginning, or whatever strange ideas tomorrow may bring, the hypothesis has to be considered on its merits, however offensive it may be to our common sense intuitions, which are simply not relevant. We cannot get out of our skins. We will never overcome the moon illusion or the sight of the setting sun. But we have come to accept that these perceptions are simply further facts to be explained, no more a trustworthy guide to reality than the mechanical philosophy. With the collapse of the traditional theory of matter or body, a dualist metaphysics of the Cartesian kind becomes unstatable. The world is just what it is, including the properties that were previously called mental. We can continue, for descriptive purposes, to distinguish physical or material from mental, but recognizing that the usage carries no metaphysical connotations. It does not divide the world up into two categories of things. The conclusion that should have been drawn from Newton's demolition of the common sense theory of matter is that human thought and action, the creative aspect of language use, for example, must also be properties of organized matter, nothing more. And that conclusion was indeed drawn most forcefully by the 18th century physician and philosopher Lemaitre, who had to flee from France and then from Holland to the protection of Frederick the Great because of these heresies, which were reviled and suppressed until quite recently. In fact, it's rather recently that his work was published for the first time. A generation after Lemaitre, this is late 18th century, in more tolerant England, the eminent chemist Joseph Priestley concluded that a complex organized biological system has properties that traditional doctrine would have called mental and physical. Just as matter has, I'm quoting him now, just as matter has the property of solidity, Priestley wrote, it has powers of attraction and repulsion, and the powers of sensation or perception or thought are as much properties of an organized system of matter as electricity or magnetism. Thought in humans is a property of the nervous system, or rather of the brain, Priestley continued, just as much the necessary result of a particular organization as sound is the necessary result of a particular concussion of the air. Another 18th century version was that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile. The next question is how organized matter can have these properties. Progress in answering this question is essentially zero. Matter and mind are not two different kinds of things, but they pose entirely different kind of problems to human intelligence, so it appears. The difference is not metaphysical, but epistemological. That is a difference not about the reality of the world, but about our capacity to understand it. We should be able to learn something from the course of subsequent inquiries into matter and mind, and the difference is indeed dramatic. Inquiry into matter has achieved remarkable insights. This century, furthermore, has witnessed the unification of chemistry and physics, later much of biology, offering the hope that the evolution and growth of human organisms might fall within a unified theory of nature. Progress has been so great that some physicists now imagine what they call a theory of everything, a grand unified theory of nature, although everything, we should remember, still excludes fundamental properties of organized matter, those that were traditionally assigned to the mind. After the achievements of quantum theory and the discovery of DNA, it was widely assumed that the next scientific frontier would be the human mind and its manifestations in thought and action, judgment and evaluation, creation and understanding. In the 1950s, there was considerable optimism on this score and many extravagant claims. The emerging cognitive sciences, it was expected, would carry us across this frontier, assimilating the study of human thought and action to the core natural sciences. By the end of the century, many then believed we would not only understand human thought, but would be able to duplicate it or even transcend it with artifacts, meaning then computers. Speaking personally, I did not share these expectations, hopes, or fears, depending on one's point of view, and remain very skeptical today. I was a graduate student at the time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was more or less the center of work on this topic. In fact, it seems to me that no significant progress has been made in understanding such matters as the creative aspect of language use, or the more general fact that while humans may be incited or inclined to act in a certain way, they may choose otherwise, or the nature of consciousness, or the basis for moral and aesthetic judgment, and other classic concerns of the study of mind. These remain, as far as I can see, as mysterious as they've always been. A great deal has been learned about what David Hume called the secret springs and origins by which the human mind is actuated in its operations. Theoretical understanding has reached some depth in the study of the computational systems that enter into knowledge of language and interpretation of what we hear. Similar inquiries into the visual system have advanced toward the study, towards discovery, actually, of the cellular basis for the computational representational systems of visual perception, something which is still remote in the language case. And there has been progress in determining the innate structures of mind that underlie the knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge and understanding. These studies may well come to be integrated with core natural sciences. But these achievements, though real and significant, do not reach to the classic questions, which remain mysterious. We can stare at them, but not much more than that. It's not obvious why human inquiry should be able to proceed with often dramatic success in certain directions, while it appears to be completely blocked in others. One possibility is that the directions that are blocked are somehow more intrinsically difficult, but it's hard to make much sense of that idea. A second possibility is one hinted at by Descartes in the remark that I quoted. The distinction reflects the nature of our cognitive capacities. Our biologically determined modes of thought and of understanding. That seems actually a much more promising path towards understanding of this fundamental distinction. Every organism has innate properties that enable it to develop along a certain course to attain a rich and highly articulated state with only minimal interactions with the environment. An embryo becomes a person or a chicken because of a specific genetic endowment. The very same intrinsic properties preclude other possible courses of development. Varying the nutritional environment will not change a chicken embryo into a person. And the same is true of cognitive development. a rat can learn to run certain kinds of mazes as well as humans, maybe even better, but it could never learn its way through a maze in which, say, a left turn is required at every prime number, or even, in fact, much simpler ones. For every organism, its cognitive structure distinguishes between problems it might come to solve if it worked on them hard enough, and others that are permanent mysteries for intrinsic reasons of structure and design. For any organism, then, we may make a rough distinction between what we could call problems and mysteries, the problems falling within the organism's cognitive capacities, the mysteries not. What's a problem for one organism may be a mystery for another, and there's no reason to expect a simple hierarchy of organisms in this respect. To a first approximation, at least, that's what we expect to find in all aspects of growth and development, including cognitive growth. Assuming that humans are part of the natural world, not angels, the same must be true of us. We should therefore not be surprised to discover that in some domains we seem to be able to formulate questions in ways that allow us to proceed with serious inquiry and to attain a degree of understanding, while in other domains the answers seem to elude our grasp, perhaps because we're ill-equipped to deal with questions, even to formulate them properly, much like a rat faced with a prime number maze. The rat simply lacks the concepts intrinsically that make it possible to run that maze, although we can do it, and we may lack the concepts intrinsically that enable us to come to terms with traditional problems of mind. There's no reason to suppose that nature has endowed us with the ability to answer the questions that we can pose, or even to pose the right questions, those that might lead to an answer for a differently organized intelligence. It's a common fallacy to which some of the greatest minds have fallen prey to believe that humans are well equipped to discover the mysteries of the universe because they have evolved as problem solvers. How else, it is argued, could we be so successful in intellectual inquiry? Many have wondered, I'm quoting, that our limited mind should penetrate the secrets of nature so often and so well. That's Einstein. And many have speculated, as Einstein also did, that some kind of pre-established harmony guarantees this achievement. Some have appealed to Darwinian arguments to try to establish the alleged point. But the descriptive observation is incorrect, and the argument does not work. It is not true that our minds penetrate the secrets of nature often and well. If we inspect the problems that exercised classical Greece, most of them are as impenetrable to us as they were then, including those of the greatest human significance. We often do not have even bad ideas as to how to proceed. In dealing with other human beings, we are constantly making judgments about such matters, but only by what's called intuition, another biological property that we simply do not understand. As for the appeal to Darwinian evolution, it makes little sense. In hunter-gatherer societies, which is virtually all of human evolution, there was no reproductive advantage to an ability to solve problems of quantum theory or higher mathematics, nor is this even true in the modern period, trivially. Evolutionary, and that's what Darwinian evolution rests on. It's the only thing that it rests on. The evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin, sort of making fun of these Darwinian, fake Darwinian arguments, he has even argued, at least semi-seriously, that there might be evolutionary pressures facing limited curiosity and initiative. The idea is that in a hunter-gatherer society, if one person is imaginative and creative and has a lot of energy and initiative, he may go out and hunt the saber-toothed tiger, which will be good for the other people sitting around the fireplace if he happens to catch it, but is likely to be bad for him. And that means that he and his genes are not likely to survive, while the ones who are sitting quietly around the fire, lacking imagination and initiative, they may reproduce just fine. And remember, that's the core of Darwinian evolution. It's reasonable to regard the natural sciences as a kind of chance convergence between aspects of the world and properties of the human mind-brain, an accident which has allowed some rays of light to penetrate the general obscurity, the so-called physical, but not central domains of the mental. Well, insofar as such speculations are plausible, they would in part vindicate Descartes' speculation that I quoted about the limits of intelligence and about the crucial divide between causation of behavior by situations and internal states on the one hand, and appropriateness of behavior to situations on the other, between machines which are compelled and humans who are only incited and inclined to act in specific ways. In the post-Newtonian era, the divide is not metaphysical, but epistemological. It may nevertheless be as unbridgeable as the Cartesians assumed for a human intelligence. Similar considerations arise in connection with other aspects of creativity and culture. Suppose that Martian scientists with intellectual capacities exceeding ours, much as ours exceed a rat's, were watching the course of human development. About half a millennium ago, they would have noticed that in one tiny corner of the world, a basis was being laid for considerable surplus production, which would permit a fairly large number of people to devote themselves to science, the arts, philosophy, and other intellectual work. Incidentally, they would also have noticed that in this little corner of the world, the people happened to be unusually fierce, violent, and genocidal. The chance, and might well have predicted that they would conquer the world, as in fact happened. Having discovered that human cognitive and aesthetic capacities are richly structured, endowed with far-reaching scope and strict limits, the Martian observers would expect human inquiry and creative achievement to follow a certain course, blocked from other courses that the Martians, with their differently constituted intelligence, might readily envisage. With sufficient understanding of human nature, the Martian scientists might well have been able to predict which directions would be taken, which ones blocked or ignored, as we can pretty much do for rats. They would also predict that at some point, human capacities would approach a kind of limit. That is, really exciting new achievements in the sciences and the arts would become harder to obtain, even to appreciate if someone else obtains them. The cutting edge would increasingly become the preoccupation of a fringe group, less accessible to the general public. Unwilling to keep to conventions that have been extensively explored and unable to pass beyond the limits of biologically determined capacities, artists might even be led to create mockery of convention as an art form in itself, basically Dada and all that follows from it. Assuming various capacities to be more or less comparable in richness and structure and texture, the Martian observers might have predicted half a millennium ago that these tendencies would roughly coincide across cognitive and aesthetic domains. In short, they might have predicted something like what has been called the crisis of modernism of the 20th century, which actually manifests many of these properties, one might argue, perhaps for the reasons indicated. Such speculations, even if they have some merit, a tiny fraction of the species have ever had the opportunity to explore their intellectual and aesthetic capacities. Enlightenment thinkers held that man's inclination and duty to think freely is the germ on which nature has lavished most care. It's Kant's words, to inquire and create are the centers around which all human pursuits more or less directly revolve. Wilhelm von Humboldt wrote, so there is something degrading to human nature in the idea of refusing to any man the right to be a man by infringing on the right to cultivate the inner life of the soul. If so, we can only conclude that retrograde social structures and the oppressive ideologies that sustain them are profoundly degrading to human rights and nature, and no one can even guess what untold treasures remain to be unearthed if these constraints are lifted. I should say that I'm quoting from the people who are at the foundation of modern classical liberal thought. This work of Wilhelm von Humboldt, for example, is what inspired John Stuart Mill, and it's essentially the origins of what is today called classical liberalism, modern libertarian thought, which has changed dramatically, needless to say, since its origins. Nonetheless, the basic argument remains true, despite the doubtless unexplored treasures. As part of the natural world, humans face problems and mysteries, and it may turn out that many of the questions that are central to our lives are mysteries to the rational intelligence to be explored only in other ways. This is not necessarily a pessimistic conclusion. We may be better off lacking the kind of understanding of ourselves that the hypothetical Martian observer possesses. We are not, however, better off in a social world in which people are denied the right to exercise their capacity for free thought and action, to control their work in voluntary association with others, and are otherwise deprived of rights that are rooted in their fundamental nature, if the Enlightenment thinkers were correct. Nor can we justify such degrading social practices on the basis of our inability to ground our values and ideals in a science of human nature, surely now, perhaps ever. There are other ways of coming to appreciate who we are. Difficult as it may be to pronounce these words in this terrible century, it still seems that over time there is a kind of moral progress, which perhaps may amount to a deeper insight into our true nature. To take one example, not too long ago, human slavery was considered legitimate, even praiseworthy. The debate over slavery was, in part, conducted in a rational way on shared moral grounds. These grounds have since broadened, not solely through argument, of course, but it is now recognized that ownership of a person is such a profound infringement on fundamental human rights that no argument can justify it. It seems fair to see here a sign of moral progress, an expansion of the moral realm to include creatures who had been excluded from it by primitive doctrines that had not yet been overcome. Some of the problems of moral culture that face us with no less urgency in the late 20th century are illuminated by a look at the arguments that were advanced by the slave owner. Some of them were not so easy to rebut. Suppose that I own my automobile and you rent your automobile. Then we can safely guess that my automobile will be in better condition than yours as time passes. That is, the owner will try to protect his investment, while the renter will simply replace the worn object by another. Correspondingly, if I own my workers and you rent yours, it's likely that mine will be better off than yours over time. The slave owner is therefore a more moral being than the capitalist, so he argued. Not an argument that's easy to rebut. And such thoughts were not lost on poor and working people at the time. They were very conscious of them. Shortly after the abolition of slavery during the American Civil War, one of the founders of the Knights of Labor, which was the first large organization of working people, called for, I'm quoting, called for the complete emancipation of the wealth producers from the thraldom and loss of wage slavery. This, that is, of being rented and of having to rent yourself in order to survive. This conception, which can be traced back to the leading principles of classical liberalism, was adopted almost as a reflex by working people who were struggling against violent repression and horrendous working conditions. Unlike the masters, the common folk took quite seriously the principles of liberty and justice that they had fought for in the Civil War. Many of them considered the conditions of so-called free labor to be a system of slavery as absolute, if not as degrading, as that which lately prevailed in the South. Quoting a reporter for the New York Times, believe it or not, describing the new era in which manufacturing capitalists are the masters. That insight, incidentally, could not be expressed by his counterpart today, or even come to mind, which is one of many signs of the deterioration of civilization and culture in the past century. It's not all progress. A century ago, the founder of the world's first billion-dollar corporation, the U.S. steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, was always ready to connive with the state authorities to fill his pockets and to call upon state violence to force his workers to slave 12 hours a day at pitiful wages while the industrial towns that he ran became virtual prisons. But his moral sensibilities required him to tell the New York Times that socialism, with its commitment to eliminate the wage slavery that he imposed by state violence, is the grandest theory ever presented, and I am sure someday it will rule the world, and when it does, we will have attained the millennium. Not in his lifetime, he made quite sure. It's worth remembering how deeply rooted these libertarian ideals are in classical liberal doctrine. So take Adam Smith. Everyone knows Adam Smith's praise for the division of labor in the opening sentences of his classic Wealth of Nations. But very few people have gone on a couple of hundred pages to read his bitter condemnation of its destructive effects. I'll quote Adam Smith. "The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too, perhaps, are always the same or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to be. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall unless government takes pains to prevent it." That's Adam Smith. Society, in short, must find ways to overcome the devilish impact of the invisible hand. Adam Smith's hatred of capitalism is not well appreciated today, largely because he's not read. Other major contributors to the classical liberal canon go much further. Humboldt, who, as I mentioned, inspired John Stuart Mill, described the leading principle of his thought as the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity, a principle that is only undermined by the narrow search for efficiency through division of labor, but in fact by wage labor itself, which is equally intolerable. Quoting Humboldt, "Whatever does not spring from a man's free choice, or is only the result of instruction and guidance, does not enter into his very nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness. When the laborer works under external control, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is." You'll notice that in all of these early quotes, the only people who exist are male. That's another respect in which the moral realm has expanded very recently, in fact. Ordinary people do not have to read the classics to learn these simple truths. The elite culture, at least, has succeeded in repressing the classic libertarian arguments against wage slavery. And I want to stress the elite culture. To this day, almost half the population of the United States find the phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, half the population find it to be such an obvious truth that they attribute it to the U.S. Constitution, a text that's largely unknown, but taken to be akin to Holy Writ. How many accept the dictum as valid, we do not know, nor do we know what the numbers would be if they had ever heard the subversive thought discussed, something that is quite unlikely in a culture that protects the doctrines of the powerful with the kind of dedication that any dictator would admire. Despite the efficiency of the guardians of doctrinal purity, the condition of so-called free labor, meaning rented labor coerced by need, is as abominable to most of the population as it was to the founders of the classic liberal ideals that are so severely distorted today in the interests of power and privilege. Well, these are some of the problems of moral culture that arise with great force and great urgency at the end of the 20th century. We enter here into territory that cannot be properly explored in a few words. And again, speaking in Barcelona, I cannot bring myself to leave the topic without recalling what was achieved here, however briefly, in another civil war just over 50 years ago. It was a vision described simply and eloquently by George Orwell in his greatest work. The Barcelona that he saw in 1936, I'm quoting Orwell, was really a worker state in which everyone looked you in the face and treated you as an equal, a spectacle that was queer and moving, with much in it that I did not understand, in some ways did not even like, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. They were reaching for levels of moral culture that remain well beyond our social and cultural horizons, though they were articulated long ago in classics that we are taught to revere, and they have occasionally been realized, at least in part. Needless to say, these aspects of Orwell's work are as little known as the truth about Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberal thought. The excitement, in fact, Orwell's book couldn't appear in the 1930s, except in a few hundred copies. It was published later as a kind of Cold War document, something that he would have detested had he still been alive. The excitement and the challenge of inquiry, discovery, and creation can only be appreciated by those who have been lucky enough to experience them. Far too few people in societies in which most human beings are forced to work under external control as cogs in a machine. But for the great majority of the world's population, even that fate is beyond their hopes. I spoke before of the abolition of slavery, but what I said is so untrue as to be a disgrace. The London Anti-Slavery International, which monitors slavery conditions around the world, estimates that 100 million people are living in slavery. And that terrible crime cannot be blamed on others. The worst regions are those that have long been under Western influence and control, another fact that's regularly suppressed in public commentary, though recognized in the scholarly literature. Take Brazil. There's a very highly regarded study of U.S.-Brazilian relations, scholarly study, by the senior historian of the CIA, Gerald Haynes. I didn't know until I read the book that there was such a position, but apparently there is. He writes that immediately after World War II, the United States took control of Brazil and used it, I'm quoting him, used it as a testing area for modern scientific methods of industrial development. And the results, he says, are a real American success story. America's Brazilian policies were enormously successful, bringing about impressive economic growth based solidly on capitalism. This was 1989, incidentally, that this book was written. Haynes does not go on to record these amazing successes of capitalism, which demonstrate our magnificence in comparison to the hated enemy, but we might nevertheless mention a few. The level of poverty and suffering for the overwhelming majority is so extreme that 10% of Brazilian children are estimated to be involved in prostitution, suffering violence, rape, and all forms of sexual abuse. Beyond rescue, lawyers working with child prostitutes allege, because after 6 months they're psychologically dead. Their phrase. Brazil is probably the world center of such triumphs as child slavery, with some 7 million children working as slaves and prostitutes, exploited, overworked, deprived of health and education, deprived of their childhood, an International Labor Organization study estimates. The luckier children can look forward to work for drug traffickers in exchange for glue to sniff to make the hunger go away. I might add at this point that one of the, since the U.S. achieved its will in Nicaragua, the country has been collapsing into free fall. But there is one, actually there are two aspects of the economy which are improving. One is there's a vast increase in drug use. And the second is that there's an increase in sale of shoe cement, which goes primarily to street children to enable them to overcome their hunger by sniffing glue. So everything isn't a failure. Going back to Brazil, Brazil also wins the prize for torture and murder of street children by the security forces. It's a process of extermination of young people, according to the head of the Justice Department in Rio de Janeiro, targeting the 7 to 8 million street children who beg, steal, or sniff glue, and for a few glorious moments forget who or where they are, quoting London Guardian correspondent. In Rio, a congressional commission identified 15 death squads, most of them made up of police officers and financed by merchants. Bodies of children murdered by death squads are found with their hands tied, showing signs of torture, riddled with bullet holes. A Brazilian parliamentary study reported that 7,000 children had been murdered from 1987 through 1991. Brazilian police are now investigating cases of illegal trafficking in human organs, primarily children's organs, though investigators report that evidence is hard to verify, particularly concerning children who are kidnapped for organ transplants. The problem is that witnesses quickly disappear. Victims found alive after corneas and kidneys are removed are heavily drugged or terrified of retaliation, as are their families. That's incidentally a horror that's rampant through the domains of Western power, according to many reports. It took real talent to create a nightmare in Brazil, which is a rich country, spectacularly endowed with resources, facing no external enemy, and fortunate enough to have been selected as the beneficiary of the kind tutelage of the leader of the free world, a testing area for modern scientific methods of industrial development under capitalism since 1945. That story, to our shame, can be repeated throughout the regions that have been subjected to the European conquest of the past 500 years, which was just commemorated a few weeks ago. Those who are willing to face the truth about the 500-year conquest with honesty will at least cross the threshold to a sparsely populated civilized world, and they may then turn to the obligatory task of helping to rebuild something from the wreckage. There can be no clearer measure than this of the level of moral culture to which we aspire. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. We'll now take questions from the audience. Si hay preguntas, les ruego que levanten la mano y esperen que llegue a usted el micrófono. Eso es para tanto por la megafonía como por los intérpretes.
You were talking on the general subject of creation and culture. I would like your comments on a major difference between the English language and the Spanish language, and something that is coming into existence in the Catalan language. In the English language, there is no official body which determines exactly what is correct. In Spanish, there is the Academia Real de la Lengua, which dictates what is correct, what the spelling is correct. It is a prescriptive grammar, while in English we have a descriptive grammar. Now that the Catalan language is being normalized, this question is becoming quite relevant. Should there be a standard Catalan? I wonder if you'd like to give us your opinion on these two types of grammar.
Well, I'll be happy to say something, but I want to make it clear in advance that I'm not speaking as a linguist. Linguistics tells you nothing about this topic. This is a topic of power and authority and so on. So I have no professional competence to talk about the topic. What I say is just, comments of a human being. In my opinion, insofar as the authorities fix a standard spelling, that's probably an advantage. It's a nuisance to have to read 18th century texts where every word was spelled differently, even by people who spoke exactly the same way. It's easier to read texts where the spelling is uniform and you pronounce them any way you feel like. So the spelling regulation seems innocuous and probably helpful. As to the question of descriptive versus prescriptive, we have to bear in mind that while an academy is a particular form of prescriptive, authoritarian determination of what you should do, there are many other forms of authority too. There are schools, there can be an authoritarian culture that simply requires you to act like certain models. And in the United States, there's a lot of that. It's a very free society in the sense that there's no official authority. But the culture is, in many respects, authoritarian, and there are a lot of pressures to act in a particular way, not in some other way. Actually, I can give you a personal example that failed. I grew up in an urban, kind of a lower middle class urban environment without any particular social graces. And when I went to Harvard as a graduate student in the early 1950s, in a special high-class research outfit that, had all sorts of prestigious elite people, I discovered that a large part of the education was simply refinement, social graces, drinking, what kind of clothes to wear, how to, have polite conversation that isn't too serious, and all the other things that an intellectual is supposed to do. In fact, I remember a couple of years later asking a distinguished British philosopher from Oxford, which was the model that this was attempting to imitate. He came and visited our imitating organization, and I asked him how he thought that Harvard's imitation compared with Oxford's original, and he thought for a while, and he said he thought it was the difference between a genuine superficiality and a fake superficiality, phony superficiality. We only had phony superficiality. They had genuine superficiality. Well, this is a large part of what's called education, and it's teaching conformity to certain norms that keep you from interfering with people in power and all sorts of other things. And it doesn't take a national academy to do that. In fact, you can imagine a society that has an academy that dictates forms and nobody pays any attention to them because it's a free culture. So I think the real question is what kind of a culture there is. And that's the kind of thing that people create. You know, they create the kind of culture that they want to struggle for. My tendency would be towards a freer one, but that's something people have to decide.
Thank you. In your work, you make a distinction between Plato's problem and Orwell's problem. I know your talk is not about Plato's problem, and I've read your solution to Plato's problem. Could you tell us what the solution to your Orwell's problem could be? I guess you've suggested it, but...
The reference is to two problems that are related but seem very different somehow. Plato's problem, the problem posed by Plato, was how we can know so much when we have so little evidence. That's the main theme of Plato's inquiry into humans. How can we know so much when we have so little evidence about it? And he concluded he had an answer. It comes from inside us. And that answer, I think, is more or less correct, although today's formulation of it would be radically different from Plato's. His answer was ultimately in terms of reminiscence from an earlier existence, whereas our answer would be in terms of the long-term development of the genetic endowment. So that's a difference, but the logic of the answer is more or less the same. Orwell's problem is something, which, attributing to Orwell, seems to me a large part of Orwell's work was asking the question, how can we know so little when we have so much evidence? In short, how are we prevented from understanding such simple and obvious things about the social world around us? And the answer to that problem, I think, lies in the techniques of manipulation that tend to grow as societies become more free, almost automatically. I mean, when a society is, let's say under Franco, I guess, they probably didn't have to spend a lot of time convincing people of things, because if you had the wrong idea, you'd be sent down to the Madrid torture chamber or something like that. And typically under authoritarian societies, there are ways of controlling people by force, and that's most of the world until quite recently. As societies have become more free through a lot of popular struggle in certain parts of the world, it becomes necessary to control people in other ways. The leading principle remains. The leading principle of people with power and privilege always remains. The general public has no business interfering in public affairs. Now, sometimes you can control them with a whip, but if you lose that capacity, you have to control their thought. I mean, that's been noticed as far back as David Hume, who wrote about it. You have to control opinion, as he put it. Other ways of controlling people, that's Orwell's problem. What are the means of controlling people beyond force? There are a number of ways. Propaganda is one way. Marginalization, diversion is a second way. If you can get people to be watching the television set all the time or something, that just diverts them. They're not paying attention to what matters. Scattering people is extremely important. It's necessary to break down organizations. That's why in the freer societies, like the United States, which is maybe the freest country in the world, there have been such intense efforts, and successful ones, to break down any organizational structure. Unions, for example. Labor history in the United States is unusually violent. and labor unions have been virtually wiped out by a huge amount of business propaganda running from cinema to, almost everything. They're practically gone. And the same is true of other organizations, because people are just too dangerous when they get together. When people get together, they can have thoughts and have ideas and put them forth in the public arena, and they begin to enter that area where they don't belong, namely influencing public affairs. So separating people and isolating them is a technique of control. Another technique of control, which is actually being sort of pioneered in the contemporary period, both in Europe and the United States, is raising the level of decisions to be so remote from people's knowledge and understanding that they don't even know what's going on. They have no idea what's happening. They can't find out what's happening, and certainly can't influence it if they do. That's the meaning, in my opinion. It's part of the meaning of the sort of de facto world government that's developing, which, like most governments, is reflected in economic power. This one is rooted in the economic power of transnational corporations and supranational banks, and it's an international world government which has its own institutions, like the GATT or the IMF or the World Bank, the meetings of G7, the executive sessions of the 7 rich countries. In the United States, the North American Free Trade Agreement, currently being rammed through. In all of these cases, the decisions are made, actually in the business press, in the international business press. This is all described pretty frankly as what they call the new imperial age. And in the new imperial age, you really don't have to worry about the public. They have no way of finding out what's going. I mean, who knows what's going on in GATT meetings, let's say, or in the offices of the IMF and so on. And remember that the transnational corporations and banks, which are by now huge, I mean, they probably account for their internal transactions, which aren't really trade, account for probably somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of what's called world trade. But that's just internal moving of things around, internal to a single authoritarian institution. And the decisions that are made at these very high levels have enormous influence on people's lives. Take, say, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Nobody can really have an opinion on it because it's basically a secret. You can't find out anything about it. The Congress 20 years ago passed legislation, a Trade Act, requiring that in any trade-related legislation or treaty, there has to be consultation with what they call a labor advisory committee that they set up, which is based in the unions, such as they are. That's by law. They have to give an analysis and a critique of any trade-related issue, obviously NAFTA. Well, they were informed by the White House that their report was due, I think it was on September 9th. They were not given an inkling of what was in the report until September 8th. They couldn't even convene to meet. And then they weren't given the whole treaty. It's a huge treaty, hundreds of pages. They did write a response to it anyway. It was a very angry response, both because of the utter contempt for democracy revealed by this, but also because from the glimmerings of what they could get out of the treaty when they sort of flipped through it in a couple of hours, it became pretty obvious that it's going to have a devastating effect on American labor and probably a devastating effect on Mexican labor, though it will be beneficial, highly beneficial, to American investors and probably to Mexican investors. It's also very likely to have a highly destructive effect on the environment. Its laws supersede federal and state legislation. Whatever exactly may be in it, it's obviously of great significance. And the public has no way of influencing it because the public doesn't know what's going on. In fact, the public doesn't even know that it doesn't know. That is, For example, the report of the Labor Advisory Committee was never reported in the press. The press is loyal. It doesn't tell people things they're not supposed to hear. And one of the things they're not supposed to hear is that they don't know what's going on. The same thing's happening in Europe. In the terminology of the European community, there's what's called a democratic deficit. The democratic deficit, as you know, means the growing gap between decisions made at an international executive level and things that might be influenced by parliamentary or other structures that are somehow under popular influence, at least marginally. And that democratic deficit is sure to grow unless people do something about it. And again, that means that major decisions over people's lives are totally out of their control, even out of their knowledge. Well, that's a new technique, relatively new technique for controlling people and ensuring that the rabble doesn't become involved in what is none of their business, namely public affairs, which is to be managed by tiny elites, based ultimately on domestic power. Well, the name for all of this is democracy, and there's a class of people called intellectuals whose task is to make you believe that you live in a democracy when this is going on. But the fact is that the processes are a very natural reaction to the freeing up of the society. I mean, as the United States, for example, has become much more free over the years, and, it certainly is happening, has been happening for a long time, not because of any gifts from above, but because of continuing popular struggles. As it becomes more free, the techniques of management of the rabble have to become more sophisticated. That's Orwell's problem. The answer is not trivial. And it's interesting that no one writes books about it. Well, not very many people write about it, if you do, like me. If Orwell himself had written, instead of writing 1984, which was actually, in my opinion, his worst book, a kind of a trivial caricature of the most totalitarian society in the world, which made him famous and everybody loved him and so on, because it was the official enemy. If instead of doing that easy and relatively unimportant thing, he had done the hard and important thing, namely talk about Orwell's problem, what I call Orwell's problem, he would not be famous and honored. He would be hated and reviled and marginalized.
I am a computer science student. Should I waste any of my time on machine translation?
It's up to you.
Well, I'll tell you, I have a personal relationship to that too. When I don't want to keep telling you personal anecdotes, but anyway, when I got out of the university in 1955, there was absolutely no conceivable possibility that I would get a job anywhere. I had no professional qualifications in any known field. I had some strange collection of interests and so on, which is why I'm at MIT, incidentally, a scientific university which didn't care much about credentials. And I was hired, and the only job offer I had was as a research assistant in the research lab of electronics at MIT, where there was a project in machine translation. And the director of the laboratory was kind of interesting person with a lively mind, and he had heard a little about the stuff that I was doing. He was interested in it, and he wanted to hire me to work on machine translation. Well, we had an interview in which he asked me sort of what you asked me, and I told him I thought it was an utter waste of time and I wasn't going to spend 1 minute working on it. But if he wanted to hire me in the project anyway, fine, then I'd just do my own work. And he thought that was fine, so he hired me. It's not an intellectually interesting project. I mean, it's a kind. It may have some utility, So like, could be on a par with building a bigger bulldozer, let's say, which is a useful thing. Nice to have big bulldozers if you have to dig holes. But the chances of any progress in machine translation of any significance are largely brute force. It's kind of like chess playing programs. Best way to do it is brute force stupidity. At the moment, that seems to be the best way to do it. Because what's really involved in translation, serious translation, say what these guys back there are doing is so far beyond our understanding that you just can't work on it. I mean, you can learn more about the nature of language and so on, but it doesn't take you anywhere near the problems of serious translation. So that principled approaches to machine translation are not likely to yield short-term benefits, which means they're not going to be financed, because the financing comes from people who want short-term benefits. That's my own judgment. I mean, in that framework, people have to make their own decisions. You know, I made mine one way, you may make yours another.
I think there are a lot of English teachers here. We would like to hear your comment about your UG. What does UG, is UG still available in second language acquisition? And how does negative input work? And so on. And I hope you can comment something on it.
Let me see if I understood. You want to know how UG is involved in language acquisition and how negative...
No, I want to know your comments about the negative input.
Negative input.
Yeah, in
the
relation to second language acquisition.
To language acquisition.
Second language.
Second language.
Yes.
Second language acquisition.
Yep.
Second language acquisition is something I don't know anything about. And I don't think there's a lot to know about it, frankly. I mean, second language acquisition is another one of those things that you do mostly by instinct, because there's no real understanding of how it's happening. First language acquisition is a scientific problem. I mean, amazing things are happening to young infants, very young, in fact, even a couple of days old, with regard to their language abilities. And, you know, at an extremely early age, they have all kind of extraordinary knowledge and so on, and that you can study. There you're studying the growth. It's like you're just studying the flowering of a particular organ, almost without it. It's like studying the growth of the visual cortex. So second language acquisition is a tricky problem. In my opinion, for what it's worth, which is not much, it's like most problems of teaching, which are not problems of growth. You know, they're problems of helping to cultivate growth. As far as I know, this is mostly from personal experience in teaching, I think about 90% of the problem in teaching, or maybe 98%, is just to help the students get interested, or what it usually amounts to, not to prevent them from being interested, because typically they come in interested. And the process of education is a way of driving that defect out of their minds. But if children or whoever, you know, people's normal interest is maintained or even aroused, they can do all sorts of things in ways we don't understand. It's largely a problem of, in the case of second language acquisition, I think it's mostly a problem of motivation. I mean, I don't think there's any theoretical things that can be described. And I'm sure there are people right in this building, probably at this table, who can tell you a lot more about it than I can.
Professor Chomsky, I would like to know your opinion about, you mentioned those mechanisms of government power over to control society somewhat or to a large extent. But how TV does, for instance, like focusing on TV, how does TV really affect that on a population, a given population, and how it is used for the advantage of government, and on the general sense, what society at large should do as an obligation, I see as an obligation, to somewhat kick back and reverse this trend?
Well, as far as TV is concerned, it has a multiple utility for population control. For one thing, TV is inherently an isolating device. You're alone watching the tube, you know. And that's very advantageous for control of people. As long as you can keep people isolated, it regards it as just a truism. You know, so true it must be in the Constitution. As long as they each person thinks that individually, and nobody else knows that anyone else has that crazy idea, it's not a problem. And in fact, I should say that this is true on all sorts of issues. The United States is public opinion in the United States is studied very heavily. The reason is that business wants to keep its finger on the public pulse so they know what kind of propaganda to give them. There's a huge public relations industry, has been through this century, which spends probably billions of dollars a year on what they call controlling the public mind, and they want to know what's going on in the public mind so they know better how to control them. Government is also interested, but it's mainly business. There's a huge amount of evidence, and when you look on issue after issue after issue, you find that people's attitudes are radically different from those of the articulated elite opinion. I mean, so for example, currently, 83% of the population think that the economic system is inherently unfair, remediable, got to be changed. Well, that's something that nobody's ever heard. I mean, we have the perfect economic system. That's what it says everywhere, maybe a few flaws here and there. But inherently unfair, nobody would say that. So probably each person who thinks that thinks it alone. Or take, say, the so-called Iraq War. It wasn't a war, it was just a slaughter. But the Iraq slaughter, right before the bombing started, there were a lot of public opinion polls, and but the population by about 2 to 1 was in favor of a diplomatic settlement involving Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait in the context of an international conference on regional issues, Israel-Palestine issues, and so on. That's 2 to 1. Now, nobody who thought that had ever heard that opinion expressed, because it never was expressed. The president had said there will be no negotiations, and the intellectuals marched to in the parade on command, as they always do, and all you read is there will be no negotiations, no diplomacy. Further, so presumably every one of the people who said yes on that poll thought he or she was the only person with that crazy idea. Furthermore, it's unlikely that even one person who gave that opinion knew that just a week earlier, high U.S. officials had released an Iraqi offer to withdraw on exactly those terms. They released it, but the press suppressed it, virtually 100%. So now, if people had known that that offer was on the table and that the U.S. had rejected it, the figures wouldn't have been 2 to 1, but they probably would have been, 10 to 1 or something like that. And the point is, it wouldn't have mattered as long as everybody has that opinion alone. It's only when people get together that they become dangerous. Now, one of the advantages of, I could give many examples, but one of the advantages of TV is it keeps you isolated. Another advantage of TV is it keeps most people diverted. I don't know TV in Spain, and fortunately I don't know much about it in the United States either, because my masochism extends only so far. But to the extent that I know anything about it, it's utterly mind-destroying. It gives a certain image of the world as privileged people would like it to be lived, to be a life as they would like it to be lived. But it doesn't deal with any problems that could concern a human being, certainly no political and social problems. Children's TV is particularly grotesque. I can't remember the numbers, but I heard a talk about violence in children's TV about a year ago, and I think children see, the number may be wrong, but something like a dozen or maybe even a couple of dozen violent, sadistic murders every day. I don't mean just somebody getting killed. I mean, getting their eyes ripped out or their throat cut or something. All of these things, whatever they may be, are diverting the public from things that they might do that would be significant for their lives. And that's an advantage of TV. In the case of children, nobody knows for sure, but it's possible that it's contributing to the extraordinary level of violence among youth in the United States, especially in the cities. It's no longer surprising to find young children going to school with guns. It's possible, you can't prove it, but it's not impossible that it's contributing to that. It's certainly contributing to, in all kinds of ways, to things like, say, drugs. For example, if you beam advertisements at a black ghetto, say in South Central Los Angeles, which show, the leading hero of the local basketball team wearing a certain kind of sneaker that costs $200, kids who have no money are going to want those sneakers because that's what drilled into their heads. They want to play basketball like, Magic Johnson or whoever it is. So they're going to get that $200 some way, and there are very few ways to do it. That has effects. There are all kinds of effects on the public, and they all tend in the same direction, to make people stupid, isolated, diverted, obedient. Take, say, professional sports, which consumes an enormous amount of television. It's hard to imagine anything that contributes more fundamentally to authoritarian attitudes. In professional sports, you're a spectator. There's a bunch of gladiators, beating each other up or something. And you're supposed to cheer for your gladiators. Right. That's something you taught from childhood. I remember very well in high school, suddenly asking myself, kind of funny idea, why am I cheering for my high school football team? I don't know any of those people. They don't know me. I don't care about them. I don't care. I hate the high school. Why am I cheering for the high school football team? Well, that's the kind of thing that you just do. You're trained to do, and it gets ingrained, and it carries over to jingoism and subordination and so on. And that's another factor. As to what, we could go on, but as to what can be done to all those things, it's always the same answer. There has to be popular control over the institutions, which is the only thing that can turn them to public needs and public uses. The same reason why elites want to keep the public out of things, that same reason is why the public ought to want to be in things, so they can influence and control what happens. That's a constant battle that goes on in every society all the time.
Sí, parlant encara sobre el control de la ment pública, no creu que el model de societat especialitzada a la qual es tendeix ara també és una força utilitzada per desintegrar l'esperit crític de la gent?
Is the kind of disintegrative, specialized society that we're entering into a way to break people's spirit? Yeah. No?
Parlo sobre el model de societat especialitzada a la qual es tendeix avui en dia i dic si creu vostè que també és una força utilitzada per desintegrar l'esperit crític de la gent.
I understand. We're going to, I don't know if specialized is exactly the right word. It seems to me that the Western industrial countries are moving kind of towards third world model. Now, the third world model, like Brazil, has a huge mass of the population, maybe, 80%, 90%, that lives under conditions of total misery and hopelessness. And it has a small percent that live quite well, in fact, very well. They're often very rich and very privileged and so on. That's the typical third world model. The sector that's very rich are typically the ones who are associated with the international investors and the transnational banks and so on and so forth. That's the third world model. Now, that model has been extending in recent years. It's a reflection of what's called the globalization of the economy. As capital flows more freely, and it does flow much more freely than in the past, dramatically more freely, and making it possible to internationalize production, this phenomenon called the globalization of the economy. A corollary to that is globalization of the third world, for obvious reasons. If you're an investor in New York, and you're now able, both because of financial banks and other techniques, you're now able to move production to a high repression area. Let's say El Salvador, where you can send out the death squads to kill union organizers and so on, or Brazil, where you can make sure that people will be killed if they say the wrong thing. If you can move to high repression areas, that's very efficient for your profits, much more efficient than paying your workers a reasonable wage. Now, in the United States, this is quite advanced. So the effect is that much of the population, the domestic population, becomes essentially useless for wealth production. And increasingly, they even become useless for consumption, except what they pick up through crime, because the rich people will produce for the other rich people. There are now a lot of them. Now, the proportions in a wealthy country like the United States and an impoverished country like Brazil, impoverished thanks to the fact that it's been under Western heel for years and years, the proportions are going to differ very significantly. So in the United States, it's not going to be 10% wealthy and 80% like Central Africa. Maybe it'll be 30 and 50% or something like that. And the others in between. But the phenomenon is spreading, and I'm certain it's going to spread in Europe too for the same reasons. In fact, the opening up of Eastern Europe has been hailed by the business press as offering an opportunity to marginalize and oppress West European and, in fact, North American working people. So just to repeat one article that appeared in the London Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, the General Motors is closing 21 factories in North America, but they're opening I think it was $700 million super high-tech factory in an area of East Germany where there's over 40% unemployment and no unions and none of this nonsense. And the article said, or maybe quoted an executive as saying, that this will make it unnecessary to deal with pampered West European workers who have high wages and a lot of benefits and all of this nonsense. You can move to a real low-wage, high-repression area. General Motors does the same with Mexico or Taiwan. Last spring, when there was a strike wave in Germany, the chairman of Daimler-Benz, this huge conglomerate, announced publicly that if production workers went on strike, they would simply move Mercedes division factories elsewhere, including now Russia. I mean, part of the so-called, end of the Cold War is the restoration of East Europe to its traditional third world role as a kind of service area for the West. Now they're going to have their wealthy class too, just like every third world country does, and they'll probably be the ex-communist party for the most part. The people who know their way around and know the ropes and so on. They're the ones who Western investors are going to turn to run the local franchises. But the effect of all of this is turning the West slowly into a kind of a third world society in which wealthy and privileged sectors will indeed be specialized, as you say. But a large part of the population will be specialized in nothing but suffering. If you walk through any U.S. city today, any American city, you see it. It's not secret, and there's nothing for those people. In fact, in a place like, say, Harlem, which is the big black ghetto in New York, which incidentally used to be a center of cultural life and lively and so on. In Harlem, there was a study a couple of years ago, the life expectancy for black males is about at the level of Bangladesh. Okay, that's the richest country in the world with incomparable advantages and a very wealthy city. Well, that's what's happening. So a large part of the population is not being specialized. They're being eliminated from the system somehow. And a substantial part, maybe 30 or 40% or some number, will be there for management, for propaganda, for skilled labor, for scientific research, for all of these things. And they'll be specialized, all right. I don't particularly see that for these people, it's not a matter of destruction of the critical spirit or anything like that. In fact, they're very advantaged. That's people like me. You know, we're very privileged. The specialization doesn't hurt in that respect.
Professor John, I was remembering, I'm here, that you talk about Orwell, and he convinced people through newspeak, and that was the way to control newspeak in Orwell, right? And your work seems to parallel back themes, dialogic heteroglossia, and with the centrifugal and the centripetal forces working against language. And what I would like you to tell us is how the modern world, the powerful, use and manipulate language to convince the masses that, you know, I mean, there must be some technique that people are following them without discussion.
It's true that Orwell pioneered the concept of newspeak, and remember, he applied it in a safe area. It was obvious that he was caricaturing the Soviet Union, a pure tyrannical society, the intellectually easiest case, and also the case that's not threatening, which is why 1984 is a famous book. He had written other things which, in my opinion, were much more important. For example, essays about politics in the English language, in which he talked about similar topics in the West, which are much less famous, for obvious reasons. What does all this mean? Well, first let me say again that as a linguist, I have nothing to say about this. There is nothing in the technical or scientific disciplines that provides any insight into these questions. You know as much as I do. It's all common sense. In fact, almost everything that goes on in the world in any area we care about, there is no specialized knowledge. There's a lot of fakery. I mean, people have to protect their reputations and that sort of thing. But there's nothing known that's very hard, you know, outside of a couple of natural sciences and so on. As for the techniques of controlling people through language, I don't think they're terribly sophisticated. I think they're kind of trivial. You just have to learn that every word that's used just about has two meanings. One, its common sense meaning, and the other, usually the opposite, which is the way it's used in the doctrinal system. So take, say, human rights. Well, you know, we all know what that means. It means you don't get, if you're a 6-year-old child, you don't get murdered by a death squad, for example. That's human rights. And other things like you have, like that. Well, we know that, but we hear every day that the United States is the leading exponent of human rights in the world. Well, okay, because human rights in the Orwellian language of political discourse means the rights of the rich. And it's true that the United States is the leader in defending those rights, so it's the leader in defending human rights. But there's nothing very subtle or sophisticated about those techniques. I mean, they have their effect precisely because people don't know anything, can't know anything. I mean, you have to be a fanatic to learn about the question of U.S. policy and human rights. Actually, it's interesting. There have been a number of academic studies of the relation between U.S. foreign policy and human rights. And it turns out that human rights is measured by things like amount of torture and, you know, that sort of thing. And foreign policy is measured usually in aid, you know, U.S. aid. So the studies are usually correlating U.S. aid and the human rights situation. And there indeed is a correlation, very good correlation. The worse the human rights situation, the greater the aid. It's a correlation of a sort that's not a good correlation, better than you usually find in complex areas like this. Well, how many people in the United States know that when they hear about our inspiring campaigns for human rights around the world, and how we've won this great victory for human rights and so on? And the same's true of everything else. It takes a terror. I mean, everybody knows that international terrorism is a huge problem. And there's Libya and Cuba and all these bad places. We got to defend ourselves from them. Every couple of years, the tourist industry collapses in Europe because Americans are too frightened to come to European cities where they're about 100 times as safe as in any American city, because there might be Arab terrorists lurking behind, the street corners or something, trying to kill them. The fact of the matter is that if you take even the official definitions of terrorism, the State Department definition, you quickly find that the United States is probably the leading terrorist state in the world. If not, there are others that it's certainly up in the big leagues. And the ones it calls terrorist states are usually very minor league terrorists. I mean, Cuba alone has probably been subjected to more international terrorism than, maybe the whole world combined, certainly any other country. And that all comes from Miami. It's been going on since October 1959, still going on. But if people don't know this, and there's no way to know it unless you're a kind of a fanatic, you sort of dig out on your own to work on it, then it's easy to manipulate people into thinking that we defend the world against terrorism, and terrorism's a big problem threatening us. There's nothing sophisticated about this. It's elementary, All it requires is a highly conformist, educated sector, which is willing to keep to orders, never break ranks, do what they're told, and so on. And every society has that. In fact, there are all kind of mechanisms from childhood on to get that into your heads. And the cases of sort of statistical error, the ones that don't work, they usually are pushed off on the wayside. Now, in tyrannical or terrorist states, say the old Soviet Union, they'd end up in the Gulag or killed or something. In Western societies, they just end up marginalized in some other fashion. But the effects are not all that different, actually, when you look at them.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about, you've been talking about democracy and people regaining control, and I wanted to know what sort of structural reforms you might have in mind for representational democracy. And also, if you can give a brief, probably very incisive note about Ross Perot, I'd love to hear it.
Well, Ross Perot is a kind of an interesting phenomenon. Tells you something about U.S. political life, something interesting. Ross Perot appeared on the scene last spring. He had no program. Nobody knew what he stood for. He could have come from Mars, for all anybody knew. And within about a couple of days, he was running even with the two major candidates. In fact, if a puppet was running, probably could have come out even. Actually, there was a poll taken at that time. You remember the business with Dan Quayle and Murphy Brown? You heard of that? Everybody knows that business, yeah. Well, that was taken very seriously. It was treated as if they were two real people. A debate between the vice president and a television actress, actually not actress, a person in a television show, who responded through the show, And there was a poll at that time in which people were asked who would they prefer as president, Dan Quayle and Murphy Brown, and you can guess who won. There wasn't a poll as to who they thought was real, but I'm not sure what that one would have been. But what all of this demonstrates is something that's shown over and over again by close, careful opinion studies. People are what is called alienated. They think nothing works for them. Nothing has anything to do with them. None of the institutions work. Everything is a scam, a crooked operation. And they have no way of influencing anything. It's all out of their control. People know that pretty well, they know that they're free from police repression, at least if they're not the wrong color and poor. But they also know that they have nothing to do with anything, that the political system doesn't work and the economic system doesn't work and everything's done somewhere else and so on. They're not aware of how much this is true. As I said, they're not aware, say, that in the current NAFTA negotiations, they don't, major decisions are being made that neither they nor the unions nor Congress nor anybody else is going to know anything about. But they get the sense of it, they have sort of a feel for it. What are the structural changes that ought to take place? Well, again, as in everything in the social or personal world, what we can say is obvious, I think. We have to work to break down authoritarian, hierarchic institutions. There are a lot of them. The core ones are exactly the ones that the traditional libertarians talked about, the institutions of economic power. I mean, as long as power, as real power to make decisions, is in the hands of people who can invest and purchase and sell and so on. That's where the power to make decisions lies. Everybody saw this just recently in Europe, where the national state was no longer powerful enough to defend the currency against speculators. Well, the United States is the richest country in the world and still has the biggest economy. But just to give you an indication, the Wall Street Journal, which is sort of the journal of right-wing business opinion, ran a front-page article a little before the election, just informing people that there isn't any fear that any of these alleged lefties around Clinton are going to do anything. I mean, the business community knew that well enough, as you can see by the markets. But they explained why, even if by some accident, say Clinton or some other candidate tried to initiate programs of social reform or whatever, it would immediately be cut off. And they simply explained what's obvious. I mean, they gave the numbers. According to them, if I remember the number, I think they said the United States is deeply in debt. That was part of the Reagan-Bush program, to put the country so deeply in debt that there would be virtually no leeway for the government to do anything. There's no policies anymore because they're just too much in debt. What being in debt, what it actually means is the Treasury has sold lots of securities, bonds and notes and so on, to other people. That's what it means to be in debt. According to the Wall Street Journal, in the current age of unregulated international capital, which is huge, they said, I think, about $160 billion a day are traded in Treasury securities. And they then explained what that means. It means if the U.S. and foreign investing community doesn't like something that's happening in the United States, they can very quickly make a slight reduction in, sell off a tiny amount, just a signal of Treasury bonds and securities, which has an automatic effect of raising the interest rate, which has a further automatic effect of increasing the deficit. And they calculated that a signal that sufficed to raise the interest rate by 1% would add $20 billion to the deficit overnight, meaning that if, say, a $20 billion spending program were proposed, the international investing community could turn it into a $40 billion program instantly, just by a signal. And any further moves could be cut off by domestic and foreign capital. The same is true of, say, NAFTA. I mean, NAFTA, like most of what's going on, like the whole internationalization of the economy and the raising to higher levels of decision-making, is something that's done inside totalitarian institutions, namely corporations, which are pure totalitarian institutions in the literal sense. Control is from the top. Your relationship to those institutions is you can rent yourself to them if you like, and then they'll tell you what to do. But that's the way they work. I mean, they're the equivalent in the economic system of fascism, and they're not small. I mean, that's, as I said, it's probably like a third to a half of world trade is just internal to them. And they have an enormous impact on governments, on super government policies, and so on. Well, there's a fantastic system of power. And as long as that system of centralized power remains, anything in the public domain is going to be very limited. In fact, once again, if you go back to the origins of classical liberalism, I think you get the answers to these questions. The principles of people like von Humboldt and Adam Smith and others were that people should be free. They shouldn't be under the control of authoritarian institutions. They shouldn't be subjected to things like division of labor, which destroys them, or even wage labor, which is a form of slavery. They should rather be free. Now, back in the 18th century, the forms of centralized authority that people saw in front of their eyes were the feudal system and the church and the absolutist state and so on. They didn't see the industrial corporation because it wasn't around. But if you take their principles and you apply them to the modern period, I think you come pretty close to the principles that animated revolutionary Barcelona in the late 1930s. And I think that's about as far as high a level as humans have yet achieved in trying to realize these libertarian principles. And I think they were the right ones. Not to say that everything that was done was right, but in their general spirit and character, the idea of developing the kind of society that Orwell saw and described in the terms that I quoted a couple of lines from, with popular control over institutions, all of them, economic institutions, political institutions, and so on, that's the right direction to move. And it's not a new idea. In fact, its roots are as old as classical liberalism. Application of it to contemporary situations must involve a recognition that there are quite different sources of power and authority than there used to be, but the principles are about the same. And to the extent that people are willing to struggle for them, they can achieve gains, as has always been the case in the past. We don't live under slavery because of popular struggles. We have freedom of speech because of popular struggles. It's never a gift from above. Actually, James Madison, one of the founding fathers, put it very clearly. He said, a parchment barrier will never protect against tyranny, meaning the fact that something's written on paper is not going to protect people against tyranny, nor are you ever going to get any gifts from above. Protection against tyranny comes from struggle, and it doesn't matter what kind of tyranny it is. And if that's carried out, it can achieve many gains. There has, I think, been a considerable expansion of the sphere of freedom over centuries, and it has a long way to go.
Con esto sentimos tener que concluir la sesión. Gracias por acompañarnos. Buenas noches.